Okay, so I think we'll get started as people are streaming in, and we don't want to keep people too long beyond the stated time. I'm Tim. I'm the host today from the Information Lab. This is the second event in a series of events focused around quantified self. In essence, we were just trying to create an opportunity for lots of people to see the different ways you can sort of enter the quantified self space, but also get some sort of examples that we could show you of how to do some of the more challenging aspects of quantified self. So last week we had a session on just basically getting started. And so this week the focus has switched to essentially what happens next. Once you have the data, once you've been able to extract it from wherever you're trying to get it from, how do you then start doing creative things with it? Okay. And so in today's session, I'm joined by my two colleagues, Micol and Alice. I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves in a second. But we're going to be covering a real sort of range of topics, and we're going to try and sort of give you another flavor of, the kind of steps you can take to progress with your data. So let me start with introductions. I'll hand over briefly to Micol so she can introduce herself.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. I'm Micol, and I'm part of the 20th cohort at the Data School, which means I finished training 6 months ago and am currently consultant for the Information Lab. And later today, I will be talking about my sleep tracker viz, which I started working on during training and then completed shortly after training, just sort of to put everything into practice that I had been taught at the Data School.
Good stuff. Thank you. Alice? Alice, I think you're on mute.
Thanks, Tim. My name is Alice, and I'm from the Information Lab as well. I was in DS 17, so I finished training in January last year, and I'm going to be walking you through a visualization on my times for killer Sudokus.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And yeah, I've already introduced myself, but in my session today, I'm going to be talking about how to basically bring data sets together. So I won't sort of take too much away from the reveal, but we'll just start off with Alice, who will start talking about Sudoku. And then as we sort of thread these 3 topics together, you'll sort of see how the narrative comes together towards the end. So over to you, Alice.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, it's great.
Yeah.
I can see it.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Tim. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to be walking you through my visualization on killer Sudoku. So what I wanted to see was how long it takes me to solve killer Sudoku under different circumstances. The idea came about because I was constantly doing killer Sudokus. And one night I was thinking, these seem so much easier at night than they do during the day. I've always thought that I think better at night, and I just thought tracking my Sudoku times could be a fun way of exploring that. So I saw this as an experiment, and there were going to be variables outside of my control that would be impacting my results, such as if I had work, the difficulty level of the puzzle, and day of the week. So the experiment developed as I wanted to track these variables as well to try and make it more of a fair test. I kind of see the visualization as my end report, where I visualize and discuss my findings. So one reason that this is quite different to other visualizations that I've done is that it's primary data. And primary data is data that you've collected through original or first-hand research, whereas secondary data is information that's been collected in the past by someone else. So normally you may have your idea, you find your data, and then you visualize it and possibly get some feedback along the way. But if when visualizing you get new ideas and you have additional information that you need, with secondary data this may be fine, as you can try and source the data somewhere. But when using primary data, if you haven't already been recording the additional details that you need, then you may not be able to use the records you've already collected. So instead of it being a process of collect data, visualize, and get feedback, I find it really helpful to visualize and get feedback before collecting the data, because then as my idea developed, when I was speaking to people and visualizing, I could adapt the information I was collecting accordingly. So I sketched out my idea first, and then I mocked up some data and played around in Tableau until I had a semi-formed route that I wanted my viz to go down. And this is one of the sketches that I did. So I found planning the data collection a really important step in my end visualization, because I did this step, I knew that I wanted to investigate when I failed puzzles So that wasn't something I was originally considering. I just wanted to look at my speeds before, but it was great to add my failed puzzles because it meant gaining potential insight into accuracy. So for example, if at 2 a.m. I'm at my fastest, but I also fail 50% of the time, then that's something that I want to know, because without that information, I may just think that my optimal Sudoku conditions are at 2 a.m., when in reality, I'd be speedier, but much less accurate. So after planning the data collection, I started to collect the data. This was done manually, so I'd write the date, if I had work, the time I started the puzzle, and how long it took on the puzzle page. And the page also said the estimated time for how long the puzzle would take according to the publisher. So that can be seen on the page in the blue square at the bottom. I collected data for 10 months, so I started in January last year, and then input all of the data into an Excel table. So you can actually see here on my sheet, I have the brand and the version. These were consistent. I always used the times, and I was always looking at killer Sudoku, but I wanted to track the information in case in the future I decided that I wanted to do another kind of Sudoku, because the times also do regular Sudoku and ultimate Sudoku, or I might have wanted to look at different brands and if I found some of them much easier than others. It's not something that I did investigate, but it was good to track it in case I decided I did want to go down that route. I also looked at the volume, so that's the book number and the puzzle number. And this was helpful because it meant I had a unique identifier for each puzzle. So if for some reason that seemed like something was wrong with one of the puzzles, I could easily go back and have a look and see which puzzle it was. I had the date. So this was good because I wanted to see day of the week. So this meant that I knew if it was a Wednesday or a Friday. The time of day, so that I could track how I was at 9 p.m. versus at 10 p.m. The difficulty level, so that's the ranking there. The difficulties were moderate, then tricky, then tough, and then the most difficult was deadly. I also looked at time taken, so that was my time taken, and the average time taken there was the publisher's estimated time taken. And then I looked at, did I have work that day and whether or not it was a failed attempt. So now I'm just going to go into my visualization to demonstrate what I did after this. Oopsie, right. So the first factor that I looked at was difficulty level, as comparing an easier puzzle that should take 10 minutes to a more challenging one that should take 2 hours wouldn't really make sense. So here I looked at the average time it took me for the puzzles for that difficulty level. And then I also looked at the percentage of my time as my time as a percentage of their time. And then on the left here, I have the some information about my results and findings, which are quite brief for this section. So the next factor that I looked at was whether or not it was a work day or a non-work day. I was trying to show several things here. I wanted to still see the results split by difficulty, so I still had that context in there, and just so it was a bit more of a fair comparison. I wanted to see my time as a percentage of their time for work and for non-work days, making it clear which percentage applied to which. I wanted to see which difficulty levels I'd failed a puzzle on, and if the failings were on a work or non-work day. And that's quite a lot of information to ask from a graph, so I found it really helpful to sketch out some possible charts. So I found sketching them out really helpful. It saved a lot of time because I didn't spend time creating unnecessary calculations or formatting to get rid of clutter. I would normally draw out all of my ideas, quickly rule out ones that were a definite no, and then sort of whittle it down using feedback and just thinking about how it would work in reality. And then when I had some final contenders, I'd make those in Tableau to see how they panned out on there. And I also found it really beneficial to show them to people for feedback at each sort of stage, asking, is this overcomplicated? Can you understand what this is saying? Which, if any, is your preference? Because if you've created it, the chart, there's a good chance you'll understand it, but to someone looking at it for the first time, it may seem extremely confusing what's actually going on. So it's always good to get that feedback. If I just hop back, this is the result that I ended up with. If the bar is blue, it means that I was faster on days I didn't have work. Grey means I was faster on work days. And if the circle is blue, it meant I failed one or more puzzles on days I didn't have work, and grey meant I failed on work days. There were some interesting findings here. So I could see that on for tough level puzzles, I was a bit faster on work days, and I failed some on work days. So it seems that I failed some on non-work days. So it seems that all round I was a bit better at them on work days than I was on non-work days, because I'd failed on non-work days and I was quicker on work days. For moderate puzzles, the easiest level, I was much faster on days I hadn't had work, and on work days I actually failed some. And for the most difficult level, which is the deadly ones, I was much faster on work days, but I also only failed them on work days, which indicated that I was quicker but less accurate. And again, I have some results here on the side just to kind of discuss what I had found out. So factor 3, in the next part of the viz, I look at day of the week and time of day. So getting down into what I originally was planning to investigate. And I kept the difficulty level and whether or not it was a work or non-work day aspect consistent for this section as well. So here we can see that you can choose a difficulty level and you can also select if it was a work day or a non-work day. One thing that was really important was that I needed to make sure the visualization reflected what I intended. So for example, if I did a Sudoku after work on a Friday at 1 AM, it would be classed in Tableau Saturday at 1 AM, because although to me it's part of Friday night, it's technically very early on a Saturday. So if I left this as it was, it would count that as a Saturday result and a non-working day, which isn't what I would consider it, as I'm thinking of it as a prolonged Friday night. And I did have work earlier in the day. So I made a calculation that said, if I finished a puzzle between midnight and 6 AM, then consider the date to be the day before. So it now recognizes it as a puzzle related to Friday and on a day that I've had work. This part of the chart is currently looking at tough puzzles on a non-work day. So we can see that I do seem to be faster at night, peaking at 9 PM, where I was 32.5% faster than the predicted time that they had for the puzzle, and then staying fairly consistently faster than the rest until midnight. I can also change this. So currently it's looking at my percentage of the expected time, but I can get it to show me when I failed puzzles. So if I go to the left, it's got color representation, and this is just what the color's representing, and I can change this to failed attempts. So now, once it loads, I can see that I had a failed attempt at 11 AM on Saturday, and I also had a failed attempt at 1 AM on a Friday. And we can see because the bars are still showing us the percentage of time. So I can see actually the percentage of their time. So on a Friday, that was when I was the slowest. And something that I could take from this is it could be that I'm worse at them after I've had a long week at work. So I still have my results on the left-hand side, and I also have a section for reliability. One of the things that I mention here is the limitations associated with having a small number of data points, as it speaks to the quality of the results that I have. So let's say I started out with 240 puzzles. It seems like a lot, but that's split into 4 difficulties, so 60 each, then split by workday and non-workday, so 30 each, and then it's split again by hour and day of the week. So by the end, we may just be looking at a puzzle or 2 per square. Because of this, anomalies could be the only data point I have for that hour-day combination. And there are several things that could be causing anomalies that weren't tracked, such as sleep, stress, if my house is under construction. So it's just important to recognize and acknowledge that things will be limiting the reliability of your data. And although the results may indicate something, it definitely isn't concrete. So this brings me back to some tips and ideas or some suggestions really that I have. The first one would be to make sure that you're reporting accurately. So if the only person in the sample is yourself, it's important to not report it as a blanket statement. So for example, in this case, I can't say people are more competent at complex puzzles on days that they've had work, because my data only reflects myself and not the wider community. People are really different, and someone who's had a different lifestyle, a different way of thinking, different work hours may get extremely different results. Also, it's fine to have a hypothesis. Mine was that I'd be faster the later it got, but just be really careful not to let what you think the results are going to be guide the narrative of your viz, because I sort of found myself doing that at the beginning, where in my head I was like, okay, I know these results are kind of going to be reflecting this, so I can talk about it in this way. And then when they weren't showing that, I was like, well, I guess I have to change what I'm saying, but it's all too easy to sort of make it fit what you think it should say. My third suggestion is I'd recommend giving sketching a go to see if it helps you. Sometimes you can spend so long formatting and getting rid of clutter and changing the colors when it's something that you're not going to use. So if you're doing that 10 times, it's not necessarily a waste of time if you're enjoying it, but it can save yourself some time if you just sketch it out first. But that's just a personal preference. And then lastly, I'd suggest getting feedback at all stages of the process. You don't have to do everyone's suggestions, but it helps you to see things from a different perspective and develop ideas so you can make more informed decisions. I would say this hasn't really changed anything with regards to when I'm doing Sudokus. If I was going to race somebody, I may consult the dashboard before suggesting a time, but the main benefit was that as I would have done the Sudokus anyway, getting some insight from it, especially some of the findings were the opposite of what I thought before I started, was something that I found really interesting. So I would definitely recommend Quantified Self to anyone who is interested in some aspect of themselves that they want to investigate, because although it took 10 months, I enjoyed it, and it's something that I would have done anyway. So yeah, I recommend it to anyone who's interested in things like that. So thank you all for listening, and I'm going to hand over to Micol.
Thanks, Alice. Let me share my screen. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, amazing. But yeah, wow, Alice, I'm impressed by the amount of Sudokus you got through. And thanks for sharing that with us. It was really interesting to see what your visualization process was. But yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to walk you through my sleep tracker viz today, which was my first big Tableau project, in which I guess by that I mean that I sort of collected, cleaned, and visualized data myself. I will also talk about what motivated me to embark on this project, and I will briefly touch on data collection and data cleaning. And I will then walk you through my dashboarding process. And finally, I will share with you some tips for how to go about sort of designing, or how I like to go about designing my dashboards. So first of all, why did I sort of do this sleep tracking viz? So it turns out I've always been a quantified self person without really knowing it, or without even realizing that there was a name for it. One of the first vizes I created when learning Tableau was a sort of periodic table of my favorite spices. So I guess you could call that a sort of quantified self of some sort. And 7 years ago, I also started recording a list of books I read with sort of the start date, the end date, and the author. So maybe one day I'll make a viz out of that. So then when I got accepted to the data school, I decided I wanted to collect some data about myself again throughout my training, so that I could then use the data to sediment some of the things I had learned during training. I also wanted the data to be quick to collect. I had a span of 16 weeks during the data school. And I immediately thought of sort of tracking my mood, but that felt a bit too personal to share with the wider public. Exercise would have been a good one, but unfortunately I'm a bit of a couch potato, so not much data available there. So the only thing left was food and sleep, two things that I love. My data collection method was fairly simple. I kept a notebook by my bedside, and every evening right before going to sleep and every morning right after waking up, I recorded my sleep times. I had tried using a sleep tracker app on my phone in the past, but I found it to be inaccurate, at least for myself, which is why I chose to record these things manually. I then transferred the data into a Google Sheet. Again, a very manual process. And if you're looking for smarter ways to collect your data, then don't take advice from me, but take it from Jenny, Tim, and Ellie in last week's webinar, which, by the way, if you missed it, you can find a recording of it on our YouTube channel. But anyways, on the Google Sheet, I also, as you can see, kept a record of what I ate on each day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And you can see I sort of added other columns of data, which I had not planned to do so to begin with. But one of the beauties of using personal data for vising is that you can really add as much data as you want as you go along. So for example, when COVID restrictions eased, I went back to the office on a few occasions, and I started wondering whether my sleep times would be affected by the commute. So I added a column to my data set where I recorded whether or not I was commuting into the office. I also worked from abroad for 2 weeks in the summer. And so at that point, I added this time zone column into my data set to see whether that had any effect on my sleep patterns. For my sleep tracker viz, I ended up using just my sleep data, not my eating data, not my food data, but who knows, maybe one day that will turn into something as well. So once I had collected all this data, it had to be cleaned. I did this more as an exercise for myself rather than because it was necessary. Because in theory, I could have, of course, recorded the data in such a way that it would have been easily ingestible by Tableau. So for example, I purposefully was not consistent with how I recorded the times. So sometimes I recorded my bedtime as, for example, 11 p.m. and other times I would do it as 23 p.m. or 23 on a 24-hour clock. So for my data cleaning, I used Alteryx. And here you can see my workflow, which I sort of use to clean the data and produce different outputs for the different sort of graphs that I used in my dashboard and my final viz. I will not delve into this anymore because this is not the point of today's presentation. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that whether you use Alteryx or Tableau Prep, or whether you want to practice your Python skills or other coding language, I find it much easier to practice my data cleaning skills on a data set that is my own and that I know inside out. And that is definitely one of the reasons why I enjoyed this project so much. So now for the data vizzing bit, which is what we've all been waiting for. So in Tableau, I usually start by exploring my data. So I will create lots of different graphs which answer different questions, and I just sort of let my mind wander. So this workbook I have open here at the moment is the original workbook. And by that, I mean that before I publish my dashboard to Tableau, to Tableau Public, sorry, I try to delete all the sheets and calculations that I don't end up using in my final dashboards. I sort of publish a clean version for it in case anybody goes ahead and downloads it. But what I'm showing you here is the sort of a pre-cleaning process, so it's sort of my original version, so you can get a sort of behind the scenes, if you will. So for example, if I click into this graph, this did not make it into my final dashboard. When I thought of the idea for this graph, I wanted to show what my sort of standard sleeping hours are. So on the x-axis, there is the time of day. It is now in minutes, but it would have been converted into hours, of course. And then each line or each bar is meant to represent a night. So the idea was that by glancing at this graph, I or the dashboard user would be able to get an overview of my sleep patterns. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this graph quite hard to read. And after playing around with it for quite some time and trying lots of different options, I finally settled for this graph for my final viz. And again, on the x-axis, we have the sort of the time of night. And on the y-axis are the number of nights I was asleep at a particular time. So you can see that every single night in that 16-week period, I was asleep between 1:02 and 5:40. And because there's sort of like a little drop here, that means that on at least one night, I woke up at 5:40. And then if you take this all the way to the extreme, you can see that there was at least one day when I didn't wake up until 8:35. So this is one graph. I will do this for many graphs, and then once I think I have some sort of interesting analysis ready, then I will start to think about how to tell a story with the different graphs and how to bring them together on a dashboard. And like Alice, I usually sketch out my dashboards on paper first, as I find it easier to be creative on paper than on screen. Unfortunately, I did not keep any of these sketches, which were messy anyways, so you're not missing out. And Alice already showed you some great examples earlier. But after many iterations of sketching out this the dashboard, this is what I ended up with. Sorry, let me scroll back up here. So this is what I ended up with. And so first of all, I allow the user to sort of choose a target amount of sleep. Let me, okay. I allow the user to choose a sort of target amount of sleep each night, which for me is 8 hours, so defaults to 8 hours, but it could be anything. And then the first section of my viz explores how long I slept each night, with some sort of KPIs at the top, and then a bar chart, which can flick between sort of the overall by day view and the, sorry, if I need to find a way to hide a control panel. Here we go. Okay, that's much better. So the overall by day view, and then the sort of average over a weekday view. And I can see that it seems like I slept the least on Friday nights, which is not so surprising to me, given that the weekday was approaching. I probably sort of thought that I could get away with a bit less sleep. I can also look at, right now we're looking at absolute amount of sleep. I can look at the amount of sleep versus target as well. So on Fridays, I slept on average 30 minutes less than my target amount of sleep, so 7.5 hours. And then next is the chart I showed you earlier, which shows the distribution of times at which I was sleeping, with another little switch to turn the labels on and off, which honestly is here for fun and not because it's really necessary, but I thought it was sort of fun to include it. Then the second section of my viz explores my alarm and wake up times with some more KPIs at the top, and then two graphs, or sort of two main sections of graphs. So on the left is just a simple bar chart showing how long it took me between the time the alarm rang each day and actually getting out of bed. And surprisingly, at least surprisingly to me, on Mondays, it took me the longest to get out of bed. And then what I can do is I can look at it by sort of all the days, or I can break it into whether I was in the office or not. So I can see immediately that when I was in the office, it took me less time to get out of bed, presumably because I had a tube to catch and I didn't want to miss it. Whether or not I was doing client work or training, this didn't seem to have a big effect on it. And then the time zone I was in. So as I mentioned earlier, I spent 10 working days roughly in Italy between the two lockdowns, just because I wanted to make sure I could see my family before the situation got worse again. And it looks like it took me less time to get out of bed when I was in Italy than when I was in the UK. And I think this is because, sort of looking back, it's because I was motivated to wake up quickly, because I was hoping to get in a morning swim before work. So it seems to me, by looking at sort of the like in office or time zone breakdown, that in order to wake up quickly, I need some sort of motivation. So missing a tube is a good motivation, or going for a morning swim as well. So as a result of having created this viz, I have tried building in more motivations like this into my morning routine so that I waste less time in bed, because 21 hours over a 16-week time period is just a lot of wasted time. And then finally, on the right-hand side, I wanted to find out whether there was a correlation between how much sleep I got and how long it took me to wake up in the morning. And you can see there doesn't seem to be any obvious correlation, at least if I flick back to seeing all. But you can see that on the first day of training, I was obviously very excited to start my job, and I woke up before my alarm. And on the last day of training, I got the least amount of sleep. We had an important presentation that day, so again, I'm not surprised that that was the case. And then finally, together with the scatter plot, I made a violin plot, or I guess it's half a violin plot. This is the graph I'm most proud of because of the calculations that lie behind it, but it is perhaps also the most confusing one to somebody looking at the dashboard for the first time. The reason for including it in the first place was because I'd never made a violin plot before, and I wanted to practice making one. It is also a bit mathematically dubious, but nevertheless, what it is meant to show is the distribution of minutes it takes me to wake up. So there are a lot of dots around the 10-minute wake up mark, and that corresponds to the spike here. And then if you flick, for example, to time zone, you can see that in Italy, there's this dark blue spike around the 10-minute mark again. That's all I have on my dashboard. I'd like to now quickly go through some tips that help me with the design of this dashboard. So sometimes I start a project already knowing sort of what I want my dashboard to look like, but most times I have no idea and I need some inspiration. And this is where Tableau Public is can be a really great resource. So I'm sure you're probably aware of this, but you can sort of browse for vizzes on Tableau Public. You can go to vizzes of the day. Alice's viz was a viz of the day. You can explore them, and then you can favorite. You can sort of click a star next to viz to make them your favorite viz, and then they will show up in your profile under favorites. And what I do is when I need inspiration, I sort of use this as a repository of vizzes that I like the look of or that have some interesting data analysis. And when I need inspiration, I sort of browse through these and I can draw some inspiration from them. So for example, Lindsay's CV. I really like the way her sort of title is sectioned off and how she uses hexagons and everything. And this is actually where I drew inspiration for sort of how my title looks on my viz. And actually, let me, at this point, show you the PowerPoint. So I have a PowerPoint where I create all my icons that will go into a dashboard. And you can see I sort of experimented with hexagons because I liked the idea on her viz of hexagons. The idea was to put KPIs in them, but that ended up being too messy on the dashboard, so I sort of dropped the idea. But what you can see is that I did create my title here, and this is actually a hexagon. And I pasted, I used this for Tableau. And also the sort of little buttons, which brings me back to Tableau Public actually. So if I just go back, another one of my favorite vizzes is Kevin Fleurlage's icon viz. We will include this in the description box when the video goes up. But so he made this template of different dashboard buttons, which are free to reuse, and you can download them. And what I've done for my icons, you'll see down here, these are the ones I used. All I had to do is change the color, and they were ready to use, slick looking buttons without much effort going into them. And then one last thing, quickly. So I usually want my theme to match my content. So sleep is blue in my mind, sort of like the night. But I'm not good at putting color palettes together. So what I do is I Google color palette picker. I'm not even sure this is the one I used, but it's one of them, mycolor.space. And there are tons of them online. But what you can do is if you want your dashboard to sort of have a green theme for something naturey, you then click generate and it will generate lots of color palettes. Sort of gradient, matching gradient, loads of them. And all you need to do at that point is paste them into your preferences file for Tableau, and you have some really nice looking color palettes ready to use. So those are my main tips. I hope I was able to show you that you don't need to be an expert at any of these things to start playing around and having fun with data about yourself, and also that you can gain some interesting insights about yourself by doing so. Thank you for listening. And I'm now going to hand over to Tim, who will talk about some more nifty things you can do with quantified self data.
Awesome.
Did I stop the share? Here we go.
Yeah. We'll stop sharing. Yeah, cool. I can take over now. Thank you, Micol. Thank you both, actually, Alice and Micol. I'm always impressed by the sort of the polish people have on their sort of quantified self. Is I stop at the point where I have the analysis. So very jealous of both of you spending that bit more time on design. What I wanted to do is sort of provide a mix of things. I want to sort of show you that the stuff that Alice and Micol have done is really, really powerful, but there's even more power when you start to combine these questions together. So if you were to take Alice's talk and Micol's talk, a question you might come up with is, does sleep affect the quality of your Sudoku solving as such? And so the idea is to try and bring, two data sets together. And although Alice maybe touched on this, what if you could solve that question purely using data? And so the other thing I also want to show you is sort of how scrappy this process can be. It's not always like a beautiful process. And so I want to literally show you how I go from the process of, basically getting hold of data. Some of these data sets you can get hold of too as well. And you can just go from there. Okay, so the first data set I want to sort of talk about is Google Takeout. If I just go back one screen here, this is an export capability in Google. It's really good in some ways because it's got things like, if I just Google it for you, so if I go to Google Takeout here, it's really easy to find. You just go to the first hit and this is the service. It essentially allows you to export any information that Google holds about you, including photos, everything. One of the greatest parts of this is if I just go and deselect all here at the top, and then just do a control find on location. You'll see that location history is one of those things. And I like the location history because, number one, it doesn't take too long to produce the file. And two, you can connect to it and start looking at it straight away inside a Tableau. And so a question I'm going to sort of pose to you is, I'd love to know where I listen to certain artists. So I track my music listening, and I also have location history here from Google. Now, Google has this location history based on things like Google searches. Whenever I use Google for directions, it's logging my location. And historically, I had an Android device, so it's actually been tracking my location when I had an Android device without even me asking, which is a sort of a bad thing and maybe an upside in this particular context. The other service I'm using is Last.fm. Now, Last.fm is a really interesting company. They've been around for many, many years. Historically, they were actually used by lots of companies to improve the quality of metadata in music. But essentially, in the advent of Spotify and streaming services, they were actually acquired by Spotify. And now they serve purely as like a metadata sort of collection process, mainly for Spotify, but actually for figuring out music taste around the world. But what you can do is you can sign up to an account and essentially get some information about, the things you kind of listen to. And it tries to provide you sort of insights of things that you might be interested in. To start with Last.fm, to get the data out of the API is actually very simple. Let me just make sure I am actually sharing my screen. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect, great. So if I just go over to this window here, this is actually Alteryx, and I know it went really complex really quickly there. But if I just sort of summarize what this workflow does, it's just going off to the Last.fm API, and it's doing nothing more than just using my API key, which I won't show in full, otherwise you might steal my key and do stuff with it. But also it's just going to the information that Last.fm has about me, and it's querying some information about what I've listened to recently. I ran this last night, so I've got a data set that's pretty much ready to go. I'm not going to run it now because it takes quite a while to kind of get the data in different steps. But essentially, the way this workflow is broken down is I find out what music I need to go get, essentially what new music I've listened to. I check that music to see if I've already got information about it. If I don't have information, I start to structure it ready for an API call. And then the API call is literally just combining a text field together with the characters of the artist, the song, and another ID, which is essentially related to both of those combined. And then I basically wait for the data to come back. That can take roughly 150 records per minute. So when I'm requesting the information about the artist, I'm just requesting the information about the song. I'm not requesting the information about when I listen to it. That's done in the previous step. And so at the end of this, I basically build up a database of musicians and sort of information that I'm really, really passionate about. And I've been doing this for the last decade. So I have this data set ready to go that tells me about all my music listening habits. If If I go back, I have got this Google Takeout. You simply click this button. You can tick other things, but I'll warn you now, if you if you export anything more than just your location, be prepared for it to take a number of days. One of the nice things Google have added is actually the ability to set a schedule. So you can set this to, export every month or every year, and then it can put it into a Dropbox or OneDrive folder for you. So you can know that your data is being backed up nicely and reliably automatically all the time. So if Google closes down, God forbid, you've always got your data ready to go. But once you've done that, you just select the export you want, you create it once, and once that export is running, you can then go and sort of manage your exports. Earlier on today, I triggered this, so I already have an export here ready to go that's sitting on my desktop. Okay, so that sort of concludes what I'm going to show you in the browser now. What I'm going to do first is just show you around the Google file. So let me just make this full. And the file that comes from Google is something called a JSON file. It's a very common file when we talk about web technology, because it's typically something that allows web technology to store a lot of data very efficiently. So the benefit compared to something like structured database is that you don't have to navigate the whole hierarchy to understand what's in the data set. You can just go as deep or as high as you want to go. So if I just open up my location history, you'll see that this will load up, and you can see that instantly it's able to pick out a couple of things here. So I just need to tell it which parts of my hierarchy I want, and it will go away and open that. Now, this is a rather big file, so it's 90 megabytes, but because JSON is very, very efficient, if we just go in here and we just ask how many rows of data does Google have on me when it comes to location, it's something like 500,000 rows of data. So if I just let that load, you'll see it takes a very, very long time. But we've got a bit of time to allow this, so we'll let that run. And so essentially what starts to happen here is I've got this data set and I start to see problems. As it's loading this, I'll just let it do that. I can see my latitude has this sort of notation that says E7, and I've also got my timestamps over here in milliseconds as strings. So I sort of need to solve those two problems initially. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just clear this sheet, and we'll just go in here and create a calculation. Now, I know the problem here because I've done it before. Essentially, what Google does to save money on data storage is they store this number as an integer, so a whole number, and so they multiply it by 7 to keep latitude and longitude as whole numbers. That's more efficient for a database to search. And if you need to do any analytical functions, you can just go in and just divide it back by 7. So I think that's 7 zeros. No, it's 6. One more. I need to get this right. So let's count this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Correct. Good. So I'll copy that, divide that by 7. This is a row level calculation. So I'll just call this lat and click apply, click OK. And of course, Tableau doesn't quite know that this is a geographical field because I've just not named it as such. So let's just make this a latitude, and let's do the same thing again here with the longitude. So I'll just go do this. I'll paste this in. I had it already typed, and I'll just go longitude and click apply and click OK. So now we have a latitude and longitude. If I double click them, Tableau should automatically understand them as a geography. Now, I've actually done something wrong here. If you look at the longitude, I didn't give it a geographical notation. So let's just go there and do that. And now if we just remove that again and double click longitude, double click the wrong one, double click this one, we get this. Now, you're probably thinking that's the United Kingdom and there's only one dot. What happened to the 500 million rows? Well, this is actually the average location. So if I just highlight here, you can see that it says average on there. So we need to sort of get the granular level of information here. And so the granularity is actually coming from my timestamp. So if I just go put that on detail, this map really lights up and you can see every single data point come up. So now we've zoomed right out and you can see the detail that sort of Google has about me. It even has this little trail here, which I know was on a flight. The plane must have been really low and my phone must have not been on airplane mode for me to be basically flying a straight line. So yeah, that's the only sort of explanation I've come up with that one. But if I just do very quick searches here, Just go to London, you can see that this is really, really granular detail, okay? And so what we need to do to this data set to match it up with my music is essentially I need to aggregate at some sort of level of detail. And the challenge here is that that's really kind of hard to do in a dynamic way. And so one of the great things is that really good analytical tools have this sort of logic built in. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to close this workbook because I no longer need it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you essentially how I solve this. I've got like a solution here ready to go. I was actually just going to do it, but I'm just looking at the time and the questions. So I'm just going to sort of show you how I did this. So if I open up this data source, you'll see two things. I've got my location history before, as I had before, but now you see I also have my music. So you can see this is the music information from the 15th of March, 2021. And in order to basically create some sort of relationship between these two around time, I needed to make sure that the time was actually correct. So what I did is I just did some dirty sort of, analytics here. Essentially, I said, look, there's highly unlikely I'm going to be able to have a timestamp for every single minute of the day for every single track, and vice versa. Your phone doesn't track like a real-time location for every millisecond. It only tracks it sort of periodically over time. So the chance of me matching two timestamps is going to be very hard. So what I did is instead I truncated the date and time in both data sets. I essentially said, let me truncate down to the hour. And generally speaking, if I listen to music, I just want to know what I listened to in that hour. And same with location. I can go and just get the location, and I want to know my general location within that hour. And the way it's going to do that is essentially a very crude average of that location in that hour, which just takes the lat and long for all the data points and then figures out an average position, which is not perfect, but it's going to do for this analysis. It will sort of put us in the right ballpark. Then I created a relationship in Tableau. What this does is it doesn't create a join, but it basically tells Tableau that, look, the thing that these two data sets have in common is time. Okay, so any given time, I want you to basically relate this, music with this particular location if they fall within the same time zone. And there's a lot of complications in there. I won't go into that now, but essentially it allows us to do a pretty powerful thing, which is essentially have one data set that is basically these two things combined. And so what I can now do is I can just very basically ask a simple question. So I can say, for example, let's go find Daft Punk, and let's click a tick and click apply. And I want to know, where have I listened to Daft Punk? So I can just double click latitude, double click longitude. And of course I get a data point, which is not what we want. This is just, again, the average position for all these tracks. So what I can do is I can go ahead and get the granular information on location, which is the timestamp, and put that on detail. And then we get a little bit more sort of fidelity. And then I'm going to go ahead and get the granular information on the time when I listen to it, which is this particular field here, listen date. So basically I'm telling Tableau, I know you've made the relationship, but I still want you to show me the detail. And what it's doing is it's giving the lat and longs based on an overall relationship, but it's still able to sort of drill down at a granular level. And so now I've actually, created this really nice visualization that allows me to answer this question of, where have I listened to certain artists? So if I, search for another artist here, if I just go to Lupe Fiasco, and go to my custom value list and get rid of Daft Punk and hit OK, you can see that I've actually listened to Lupe Fiasco in more places than Daft Punk. Daft Punk exclusively in the UK, but I've listened to Lupe Fiasco in America. I think coincidentally, Lupe Fiasco is an American artist, but there's also lots of sort of really rich history to this. For example, if I just zoom in here, you can see that I actually listened to it on a road trip, essentially. If I zoom back out, actually, a little bit more, you can see this little trail here. I haven't put on the fidelity of the roads and the detail because I don't think that's useful in this context, because the trails themselves sort of tell a story, and I can really start to do really interesting things. And so if I want to know, what date did I listen to this? When was this journey? I can just go ahead, grab the listen date and put it on the tooltip, and then we can hover back on this, and there we go, the 6th of July 2019. And I can generally round it up to roughly when. So it's roughly in that hour at some point I was listening to Lupe Fiasco. This timestamp here is accurate because it's related to that song. And then you can also do really nice things really easily in Tableau just by switching on density, and then I have sort of a density map for any particular artist that I'm interested in listening to. So I can really sort of go in and start to tell a story. In more ways than actually music and time and location alone could ever tell me. Because if I switch this, let's say, to another artist such as Tupac, I discovered certain artists in various sort of stages in my life. So I have sort of these very strong patterns. For example, Tupac was when I was living with my parents and when I was at university. But, you know, since then, I haven't really listened to it much elsewhere, apart from, you know, when I was working here in Warwick and Birmingham. So there's lots of really interesting stories that come out of this. And so you're starting to bring two data sets together and really sort of add value to your data sets. If you apply the kind of finish Micol and Alice have shown you, you can then start to paint really, really powerful narratives. And you can see that, you know, I didn't do anything too complex. I literally just brought in two data sets. I asked Tableau to do some date truncation for me, and then just relate them at a day level, at an hour level, sorry. And then we're pretty much good to go. So I just wanted to show you that sort of scrappy world that, you know, you have to sort of get stuck into. You know, another thing to note that you'll notice here, it says text file. You can't do this data model relationship on JSON files. You can only do it on standard data sets, so CSVs and Excel. So one thing I did is I just went into my data set and I just went to data. I just right clicked on the data set and then I just exported the data to CSV right from the data set. And then that created me a flat file that I could then put back into Tableau and do whatever I wanted to do with. So it's not always perfect. These things can get scrappy, but it's just a really nice, fun way of working with the data. So I haven't got a beautiful viz to show you, but I just wanted to hopefully show you sort of the process that's involved and how you can bring these data sets to answer questions in a more interesting and in a more organic way as well. Okay, so I'll stop sharing now. And we have a bit of an opportunity now to take on some questions. So I've got some questions here. I know some people have asked questions on the chat as well. We've got those up front. So I'll probably circle back to Alice, if that's okay. Alice, are you still monitoring your Sudoku?
I sort of do. So I still write down the times that I take for each of the puzzles, but I'm not updating the visualization because I wanted it to be really accurate. I wanted it to be the best that I could be each time. So it's quite tense. And I didn't really enjoy the puzzles as much because I was trying to be as quick as I could. So it felt like a lot of pressure. So although I'll still write down the times and everything, I'm not writing like if it's a work day or anything like that anymore.
Right, fair enough. And I think you touched on another question, which I was going to ask, which is like, how do you stay on track with logging? Because the problem with me with logging is I get bored and I get fed up. So, I mean, how was it sort of sticking to that to sort of build this viz?
Well, I did it in chunks. So I mocked up some data and I think I mocked up like 100 records and I was visualizing based on that. And then I would just, when I basically finished a book, I would just put aside some time and log it one by one. And then any that I did from that book later on, I just put a little sticky note as a reminder when I'm logging next to just do those ones as well. So yeah, I wouldn't have been able to do it daily or weekly. I would have found it too tedious, but setting aside like an hour, just having some chocolate and then working on it wasn't too bad.
Food and quantified self. It's I think there's another viz in that, right? What chocolate did you eat whilst doing quantified self, right?
What made you faster while you're doing it?
Yeah, exactly. That's really, really interesting. Micol, in terms of sleep tracking, I guess, were you using an automated way of tracking it, or did you sort of feel like you had to add more qualitative steps on top of what you were doing?
It was all manual, unfortunately. But I don't know if this answers your question, but sort of the way I guess made sure to remember to log or to track the sleep times was to literally have the notebook right on my bedside under my phone. You know, the last thing I do before bed is turn off my phone, and the first thing I do is turn on my phone. So I'd seen the notebook and sort of you know, log my times that way.
Yeah. Good stuff. Yeah, I mean, I avoid manually logging anything because I know I end up only logging instances that I remember, and that tends to be mostly negative because when you're, like I said in the last week's session, like when you're having a good time, you don't think to log something. Like if you have really good sleep and you wake up and you feel good, you're most likely to forget to log it, right? Whereas when you have a really bad night's sleep, you make sure you log that one because you want to capture that data point. And so your data points become sometimes a reflection of the tough memories rather than the positive ones, and say, at least for me, that's generally just what tends to happen. The next question: how many unfinished, unpolished quantified self vises have you saved on your laptop? Micol, maybe I'll start with you again on this one.
Not enough. I'm actually one of those people who has lots of ideas, but I never start. So the sort of
Right.
viz idea is one of them. But I haven't started it yet. I keep jotting down notes, but in terms of Tableau, unfortunately, not much.
Fair enough. Alice?
Maybe 40 unfinished ones.
Wows.
Different stages. Some of them are just about there, but I'm like, I think I can make it better, and I don't know how to yet. So,
right.
But some of them are just kind of the beginning stages where I'm like, oh, I want to investigate this, but inspiration's not come yet. So it's like a line chart with some bands at the moment.
Yeah.
So yeah, like 40.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of question. Like I have lots of data sets that I have ready to go. So not even vises. I think this question's about vises. I haven't even got that far. My big sort of fascination is where is my data? Which data sets can I get hold of? Because I'm always of the impression that once I have the data, it doesn't matter when I get to it, even if I get to it in a decade's time, and I can look back and reflect on this, period, unless I really need to answer a question, it's just a great sort of data set to have. So a lot of my sort of exploration is actually about what data sets can I have, and what's the quality of the data, how hard is it to work with, how easy is it to work with, are there new tools that collect data in a more sort of new way, and therefore as soon as you find those, always try and get into those ASAP, because the richer the history of the data you have, the better sort of, you can combine things in the future. And so I have loads and loads of data sets, think in lots of different places that I'm sure if I gave someone else all the data I had, they'd be able to produce vises for the rest of my life. But I just haven't got around to it. So yeah, really good question. Really good question. Okay, we're pretty much at 6 o'clock, so I don't want to keep people from whatever they've got planned this evening, or even morning or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I just wanted to take this opportunity to remind you that we do always have events going on, and specifically we've actually got some more events around quantified self. So if I just share my screen here, you can see we have the typical Thursday trainings at 3, but later on we also do have other events in this series. So be sure to sort of go to Meetup and find out more about all the events that we have. Everything that we do is pretty much always on here. It's a really lively community of members. We're just about to hit 6,000. We passed 5,000 only a month ago. So we're growing really fast, mostly because of this lockdown, but also, we've always had like a big community events in the past. So if you don't want to miss out, head to this page, sign up, and let us know what content you'd like to see as well on social media. Just reach out to us and give us a nudge. Maybe there's a speaker you'd like us to get hold of, or anything we can help with, especially with Quantified Self. We're more than happy to do so. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your patience as well as we went through that explanation today. I'm just trying to find Zoom here and stop sharing my screen. So thank you. We're going to call it a day there and end the recording. You can find these recordings on YouTube as well. So if you've missed a section of it, or you're not sure about something, then by all means send it in, and we'll probably answer any leftover questions in the comments of the video there as well. Okay. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you later.